Adam Neumann once said, "You don't need a good idea, you just need a good story," and this is exactly how he grew his company WeWork from nothing to a $47 billion giant in less than 10 years. However, with the company now having filed for bankruptcy, it turns out that the great story that Adam told everybody was a total lie. So here's how the house of cards fell down. Taking a look back, the story of WeWork dates back to 2010 when Adam Neumann met Miguel McIlvey. At the time, Adam had recently sold his startup called Green Desk for $15 million and Miguel had just sold his startup called GetCloud for an undisclosed amount. The two then decided to join forces and start their own company, which they would call WeWork. The basic idea was that they would take office spaces and sublet them to individuals or smaller companies. But this wasn't anything new. This has been the business model of WeWork since the day it started. So what made them any different? Well, Adam believed that WeWork could be more than just a real estate company. He viewed WeWork as a lifestyle brand that helped entrepreneurs find and furnish their dream office. And to set himself apart from the competition, Adam began offering fully furnished offices with flexible lease terms. For example, if you wanted to rent an office for a year and then move to a bigger one, you could do that without being penalized by WeWork. Meanwhile, traditional landlords would require you to sign a 3 to 5 year lease. This not only allowed WeWork to attract more customers, but it also allowed them to charge a premium. By 2019, WeWork was charging $36 per square foot in New York, while the average was only $31 per square foot. But despite these high margins, WeWork wasn't making all that much money because most of their revenue was going towards marketing and expanding. And with so much competition within the co-working space, Adam knew that he needed to double down on innovation in order to maintain his lead. So in 2015, Adam introduced WeLive, which was a residential co-living space. Just like WeWork, WeLive offered furnished apartments with flexible lease terms. And instead of renting to individuals or couples, WeLive rented to entire companies. So for example, if you were a company with 10 employees, you could rent an apartment with 10 rooms. Of course, this was far from cheap as WeLive charged a whopping $4,000 per bedroom per month. But at least on paper, it seemed like a great way to cut costs and increase efficiency. If you think about it, managing 10 individual tenants is far more difficult than managing one company. Also, companies were willing to pay a lot more because they could deduct the cost from taxes. Not to mention this freed up a ton of capital for WeWork to expand into other ventures. By 2017, WeWork expanded into the education industry by acquiring a company called Flatiron School for $180 million. Flatiron School was a coding bootcamp that taught people how to code in 3 months. And this acquisition was perfectly in line with WeWork's mission of empowering entrepreneurs because coding is very much a part of entrepreneurship nowadays. But Adam didn't stop there. He continued to acquire more companies, including a design and construction firm called Metro Props, a property management platform called Space, Gray, and even a marijuana company called Rise. And just like that, WeWork evolved into a massive conglomerate that did everything from providing office spaces to teaching people how to code to managing properties to growing cannabis. Now I know what you're thinking. How is it even possible for a company to grow so big in just 8 years? Didn't they have to make all that much money first? And to answer your question, yes, they did make a lot of money, but not from operations. You see, throughout their expansion, WeWork didn't actually focus all that much on profitability. Instead, they focused on getting a lot of eyeballs. They believed that the more people that used their services, the more likely they were to expand into adjacent industries and the more likely they were to become indispensable. As such, they spent billions on marketing campaigns and free events. They even launched a free magazine that circulated throughout their buildings. Now, although this didn't directly make them any money, it did boost their valuation through the roof. In fact, by 2019, WeWork was valued at a whopping $47 billion, making it one of the largest startups in the world. And at the heart of it all was Adam Neumann, who was hailed as the next Steve Jobs. But while Steve Jobs built Apple from the ground up, Adam never really built WeWork from the ground up. Sure, he came up with the initial idea of the company, but he didn't have much experience running a company prior to this. In fact, Adam had already started 3 companies prior to WeWork, and all of them ended up failing. His biggest success prior to WeWork was an app called Crawlers, which was a social network for babies. Yes, you heard that right, a social network for babies. Anyway, Adam sold this company for an undisclosed amount and then started WeWork with Miguel. With that being said, Adam still had a very strong vision for the company, and it looked like Wall Street loved his vision as he was able to raise billions of dollars for WeWork over the years. In fact, he raised so much money that WeWork became one of the most well-funded startups in history. Their largest investors included SoftBank, which owned 32% of the company, and the second largest was the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, which owned 10%. The problem, however, was that these investors weren't investing in WeWork because they thought it was such a great business. They were simply investing because they wanted a piece of that pie. With WeWork being valued at $47 billion, owning 32% of the company was worth $15 billion. So SoftBank bought in because they thought WeWork could continue growing at insane rates and increase their stake even further. And for a while, it looked like that was going to happen. Under Adam's leadership, WeWork continued to break records with their IPO. They were expected to hit a $40 billion market cap, which would have been record-breaking for a newly public company. Unfortunately, things took a turn for the worst when the IPO documents were leaked to the public. And when the public saw how much money WeWork was losing, the IPO was immediately scrapped. You see, during their most recent quarter, WeWork only made $169 million in revenue, but they lost a staggering $3.2 billion. It turns out that their major investors weren't willing to keep throwing money down the drain, and in late September, they forced Adam to resign from the company. While this was obviously embarrassing for Adam, he probably didn't care all that much. You see, despite all the drama, Adam was still left with his $1 billion fortune, and given his track record of starting successful companies, it was only a matter of time until he made a comeback. But unfortunately, that never happened because WeWork ended up filing for bankruptcy shortly after Adam resigned. So why did a company that was supposedly worth $47 billion suddenly file for bankruptcy? Well, there's a couple of reasons. First of all, it turns out that WeWork was basically a Ponzi scheme where they used investor money to fund their growth instead of actual revenue. Second of all, their major investors pulled out last minute, which deprived the company of its main source of funding. Third, the COVID pandemic absolutely crushed their business. With so many people working from home, demand for co-working spaces plummeted. And finally, Adam screwed up with the IPO. Had the IPO gone through, WeWork wouldn't have run out of cash so quickly. So all of these factors combined led to the downfall of WeWork. Looking back, it's clear that Adam was a fantastic salesman, but he was no Steve Jobs. While Steve built Apple from the ground up and took it through thick and thin, Adam never really built WeWork from the ground up. And when the music stopped playing, he was the first one out the door. Honestly, though, I kind of admire Adam because he created something that many people enjoyed, even if it wasn't sustainable. In fact, a lot of people are sad to see WeWork go. But with that being said, Adam got greedy near the end and he tried to milk investors for as much money as possible. And this is the same thing that Elon Musk is trying to do today. Check out this video to learn more. But until then, I'll see you guys on the next one.